Jesus, as I said, preached a sermon. And we're fortunate that Matthew records that sermon in length. Luke also records a sermon, but he records a kind of a Reader's Digest version of the short version. It's Matthew who really records most of the sermon that Jesus preached. Scholars speculate that this sermon probably went 3 to 4 hours in length. Did you hear that? 3 to 4 hours in length. It was a long evening. But even though it was long, most people were in agreement that it was probably one of his best sermons. And the reason why they say it was a great sermon is because it was so relevant. It was so practical. It was so down to earth. I mean, sometimes some sermons can be so philosophical, so lofty, so theological, that they have no real practical value to the listening ear. Well, that certainly wasn't the case for Jesus' sermon. It was down to earth. It spoke to the needs that the folks had at that time. I mean, Jesus talked about murder and revenge. People were concerned about that in those days, just as we're concerned about that now. Jesus talked about forgiveness. He talked about helping those in need. He talked about worrying. Practical, everyday things that are relevant in life. And finally, as he nears the end of the sermon, in the passage of Scripture that we just got done reading together, he talks about judging others. Now, Jesus' words about judgment are paradoxical in nature. And the reason why I say that is because, on the one hand, Jesus seems to be saying, don't judge others. But on the other hand, Jesus knew full well that there comes times in our life where we find ourselves in situations where we have to make critical judgments about others. For example, I mean, parents of young kids, teenagers, you have to make critical judgments about your children's peers. And if you judge that your kids are hanging around with kids they shouldn't be hanging around with, you're going to make action plans on how to correct that. Employers have to make critical judgments about their employees. As citizens, we have to make a judgment about all those political candidates running for president. We have to judge. These guys are out. This is the person I like. So we make critical judgments about these candidates. Time and time again, we find ourselves in a situation where we have to judge others. Every now and then, someone wanders into this church in need of gas. And I have to make a judgment about that. I have to judge by listening to their story. Are they giving me a hook, line, and sinker? Are they playing the system? Or do they have a legitimate need? And is this truly an emergency? Based on the judgment, I help them or not. So at times we find ourselves in positions where we have to make judgments about others. So what do we do with Jesus' words about don't judge? Well, I think for me, and hopefully for you, Jesus provides us with a little more information when he goes to that second verse and he says, the measure you give will be the measure you get. Now, what's Jesus talking about when he talks about measure? Well, I think, and most scholars agree, he's probably talking about grace. In other words, what Jesus seems to be saying is if you're going to make a judgment, then do it with an element of grace. Do it respectfully rather than disrespectfully. Do it politely rather than with disdain. If you have to judge, then don't condemn. And Sometimes we do that, don't we? I mean, we not only make a judgment about someone else, but we condemn them. We judge someone to be a low-life scumbag. And then we condemn them by saying they will always be that way. We judge someone to be lazy. And we condemn them by never giving them another chance to maybe change that perception. Sometimes we judge others based on sex or color or their culture. And because we judge them on those criteria, then we condemn them to an inferior status in life. Right now in many Middle East countries, women are judged as not being very important in those cultures. And so they're condemned to a second-class citizen's level. Got to cover up your face when you go out. Got to wear all this gown stuff so that no one can see you. Yes, in some countries, some cultures, judgments and condemnation are given based on sex or color or culture. So we judge. And sometimes we go a step farther. We condemn. But there's a real bad danger in judging and condemning. And that bad danger is that sometimes we're dead wrong in our judgment and in our condemnation. Elizabeth Blackwell was a high school graduate who dreamed of being a doctor. But in the 1800s, the thought of a female doctor was repulsive to just about everyone who lived in the United States of America. And so consequently, when Elizabeth Blackwell graduated from high school, even though she wanted to be a doctor, she decided she would apply to medical schools. And she applied to 8, and they all rejected her, even though she graduated at the top of her class. Undaunted, she continued to send out applications to medical schools. And finally, there was one medical school that decided to accept her. They accepted her basically because the professor and the dean thought it would be fun to watch a woman struggle and fail in medical school. Well, she went to medical school, and she didn't struggle. She never failed. In fact, she graduated at the top of her class. But even though she graduated at the top of her class, there wasn't a hospital or a medical clinic that would accept her, that would hire her as a doctor. She was judged and condemned. But she decided she'd start her own clinic, and that's what she did. She chose a slum section of the city of New York, started her clinic, basically ministering to poor people. When the Civil War broke out, she decided to turn part of her clinic into a teaching school to teach women how to be nurses so that they could go and care for all the people who were being shot up in the war. At the end of the Civil War, largely because of Elizabeth Blackwell, female nurses became accepted in the medical world. Here was a woman who was judged and condemned, and they were dead wrong about it. So that's the danger of judging and condemning. We can be dead wrong about that other individual. So be careful when you judge. And when you judge, remember what Jesus said. The measure you give will be the measure you get. In other words, judge with grace. Now there's something else that needs to be said about judging and condemning. And that is, you and I really never know enough about that other individual to judge and condemn them. We're finite beings. We see others only in part. We don't know what's going on inside of them and in their heart. We don't know what past they're coming from. We see a finite picture of other people, and that's why we should not judge and condemn. The only one who really sits in a position to see the whole story, the whole picture, is God. And so I think in these words, Jesus is implying, really, you shouldn't be judging and condemning, because that's not your position. That is God's position, because God is the only one who knows the full picture. Mo Berg was a baseball player. And in 1934, Mo Berg was placed on an all-star baseball team that was to go to Japan and play a number of exhibitions against Japanese baseball teams. Now, there was a real problem with Mo Berg being on that baseball team. You see, it was supposed to be an all-star team, and everyone who was on that team was an all-star. The two key players, Babe Ruth and Lou Gehrig, they anchored that all-star baseball team in 1937 and 34. Mo Berg was a third-string catcher. And a lot of people had problems with that. Why is Mo Berg, a third-string catcher, playing with this all-star team that's going to be traveling to Japan? A lot of people judged and condemned him for being on that team because they felt he was taking the spot that should have gone to a true all-star catcher. But they didn't have the full picture about Mo Berg. Mo Berg was not just a baseball catcher. He was a CIA agent. And he was placed on that team by the CIA because he had to take pictures of Tokyo when the team played in Tokyo. So Mo Berg went to the tallest building in Tokyo, and he took pictures of the harbor. He took pictures of the military installations. He took pictures of the factories. He took pictures of the railway yard. Those pictures, some years later, were used by General Doolittle in planning his air raid on Tokyo at the end of World War II. You see, we never know the whole picture about another, do we? And that's why it's dangerous to judge and condemn. Jesus reminds us of this in the words that he spoke on that Sermon on the Mount. And we would do well to remember it, for we're tempted to judge and condemn someone else. The measure you give will be the measure you